Hello everyone. Today we begin the fourth module of the course on ethical on moral thinking and introduction to values and ethics. And the fourth module talks about ethical theories, but before that let me just go over the various modules and the progress we have made so far. The first module we started talking about value theory. What is it to value, how valuation differs in different disciplines, that valuation as a part of making sense of the world that we come across, right. Then we have we looked at intrinsic versus extrinsic values, universal and situational values, moral and religious values. Then we looked at concepts, that we had concepts of good, right, duty, justice, equality, love, purusharth. So, these are the conceptual vocabularies to strengthen your vocabulary to talk about moral claims, to make moral arguments. Then we talked about egoism, altruism, ethical relativism and ethical universalism. Now, these are all moral concepts that will help you help you make a moral argument, to understand a moral argument, right. Now, we start the ethical theories. We talk about theories which are consequentialist and non-consequentialist theories, and then hedonism, utilitarianism, deontological ethics, ethical rules, situation ethics and virtue ethics. And finally, the course the takeaway of the course would be A, looking at the ethics in Indian tradition, and B, looking at applied ethics cases. We will take up some issues and dilemmas and try to articulate a moral argument around them. That by this time you should be clear that that moral arguments can be made, and there are ways better arguments can be made and there are worse arguments, and how one can argue on a moral matter without making it a quarrel. So, looking at the basic assumptions of the various positions proposed and decide on what is going to be the philosophy to be followed. Now, coming to module 4, we are going to talk about the first distinction between consequentialist and non-consequentialist theories. Some theories that bring about depend on consequences, and some which are independent of consequences, as the name itself implies. Then we look at various popular theories, hedonism to start with, which talks about pleasure, utilitarianism, which is a further of a theory of hedonism and consequentialism. Then deontological ethics, that is another kind of ethics which is which contrasts with utilitarianism. Ethical rules, a particular philosopher called W. D. Ross, we will take that as a case study, and how he has tried to bring about an apparatus of rules to make a moral system. Situation ethics, that well, depending on the situation one reacts, and virtue ethics, which is again another fresh new perspective landed down both from Aristotle to modern day Indian philosophy, also looking at ethics from a virtue point of view. So, let us start with what is consequentialist and non-consequentialist theories. The fundamental question that we have here is, how do you determine whether an action is morally worthwhile or not? That is the basic question that we are looking at. How do we assess the moral component or the moral denominator of any act, either in retrospective effect or in prospective effect, right. Retrospective means we are casting a judgment on an act that has already taken place, right. This is past, and prospective is when we are on the crossroads of a decision and we need to take a decision. So, when we look at the future. So, the basic question is, how can one assess the moral weight of the various available choices of action in the case of prospective decision making, right. Now, the most common answer I would think, and I have seen most of us coming up with, perhaps it comes to us intuitively, is what does it lead to, right. How do you decide an action? I mean, is not it a trivial truth that what you do is decided by where you want to what do you want or what do you hope to get by that action. You are doing this course, say if you are a college student doing this course to clear this course, you are doing it to get a degree, you are doing it to learn something. So, your actions are governed towards your goals, right. That is a clear case of a goal driven behavior, but can we think of actions which are also not goal driven? Is there anything else that can also be a crucial component? Let us say some of you who do a course and who are not in the need of a certificate, who would not like to take the exam, but nevertheless are still doing a course or watching the videos or trying to learn something. Well, what are you driven by? If you are one of them, do comment in what are you driven by. Are you driven by, there is no concrete goal or practical goal that is in your vision, maybe just to know something more, right. So, a fundamental curiosity that is driven to you. Let us hold that opinion and we will come across that when we go further into this this categorization between consequentialism and non-consequentialism. Is there something called the inherent nature of the action, independent of the consequences? That is the crucial word, inherent nature of action, which is independent I do not understand why this always comes up with a straight line, but anyway, independent of independent nature of action, independent of the consequences or result. Let us keep it. Let me put this close so that there is no confusion at all. Okay. So, inherent nature of action where it is independent of the consequences. Does it seem like a contradiction in terms that we do something for a goal, right? But is there something we do or something that can be judged, morally judged, which is independent of the consequences it brings about? So, here again the crucial distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic values come into being, and that is a hint for you to articulate this distinction, right. So, we will talk about it. So, this typically inherent nature of action is what is called as non-consequentialism. In fact, this is both are two characters, actually we must put them as add, then together they make non-consequentialism. So, when we look at an action and think that there is something inherent in the nature of the action independent of the consequences, then we are talking about non-consequentialism. We will come to that. Before that, let us look at consequentialism, right. Now, consequences itself is a term which is broad enough, and the school of consequentialism would depend on how you articulate consequences. Now, since we are in a very introductory course, we are looking at consequentialism as a in a broad category, right. But as a little bit of thought and prodding would get you to arrive at the position that, well, consequences itself is too vague, right. So, then we need to know what kind of consequences, whether it is short or long term consequences, what about intended or unintended consequences, what is the kind of consequences that we are talking about. And yes, philosophers have developed consequentialism to various strains of theories. You should have a general idea that how are theories developed. Theories start with intuitions, they start with a fundamental position, but then they are thought through and developed. So, a moral philosopher would look in the broad ambit of consequentialism, would think and look further, refine his or her theory, keep on looking at what kind of consequences and keep on making specifications till they make a big system which caters all or as many possible circumstances to explain consequentialism. So, what we are the level at which we are dealing with it right now is to understand what is the broad direction of a theory, but consequentialism can also be of various kinds, and each kind has been developed to sufficient details. As you advance in knowledge, or if you are curious, or where policies are made, they work it out in greater detail. So, for now it is for you to gather the orientation to what kind of theories are these. So, let us say I am reminded of a small anecdotal incident, perhaps imaginary, but about this distinction about intended and unintended consequences. So, it seems there was a huge crowd around a small pond of water, and so one person who is walking by the pond sees the crowd, and then he also wants to go and see, well, what is happening in the pond, and he goes there, and then a week later he is rewarded publicly for saving a drowning child, because a child was drowning in that particular pond, and he saved it. So, in his commemoration speech, he thanks the village folks for giving him the award and recognizing him, but he ends by asking a question that who was the one who pushed me into the pond, and meaning here is that he did not intend to save the child, but he was pushed somehow into the pond, and once he was into the pond, he went ahead and saved the child, right. So, a jocular example only to identify or to bring out the point that can unintended consequences also be recognized or given the sense of responsibility? Can it be rewarded or recognized, right? Can unintended consequences be recorded or recognized, and how would they compare with intended consequences? That if the person jumped into the pond to intentionally save the child, rather than having been pushed into the pond and then by the way deciding, okay, I am already into the pond and halfway into water, so let me as well as save the child, right. So, there are a lot of actions which have intended consequences and unintended consequences. So, what should we be valuing? A consequentialist has to specify whether it would value intended consequences or unintended consequences. A more serious example, or a more not just serious, but a more practical and real world example that has taken place is when we look at Green Revolution. The Green Revolution at a time when India was suffering a food crisis and we are short of food. So, we had a scientific way of cultivating food, cultivating crops, which greatly increased the output of land. Here, this example of Green Revolution can be seen in this matrix. The short term consequence of the Green Revolution was enormous production of food to satiate the demand of hungry citizens of the country. The long term consequences was a decline in fertility and over dependence on fertilizer, and eventually, as we know, the Green Revolution has made the land less fertile and less capable, as we see many decades down the Green Revolution. The intended consequences of Green Revolution as an experiment to introduce scientific and state of the art techniques, scientific techniques for cultivation at the cost of giving up our traditional organic techniques of cultivation. The intended consequence was a production of extra food that can meet the demand, vis-a-vis the unintended consequence, the long term consequences that was not could not be anticipated, or was perhaps not anticipated, was the long term decline in the fertility of land, right. So, whether Green Revolution was a successful step or not, there are strains to that particular argument. Depending on the strain you take, you can look at it whether it is successful. It did solve and definitely solved our short term problem, but it also created for certain long term problems. Now, another question of not just intended consequences and unintended consequences or short run consequences or long run consequences. It is also consequences for whom? Consequences for the agent, consequences for the community, consequences for others. And here again we can think of many examples that radioactive energy, it gives a lot of electricity or provides the much needed electricity and energy to the whole say nation or collective, but it comes at the cost of the neighboring villages to the reactor who have to be relocated or who face the risk of a nuclear disaster, right. So, whom are the consequences we are evaluating for? So, consequentialism can again be of two kinds, agent relative or agent neutral. Different agents can value different consequences, for example, egoistic consequentialism. So, here there is a difference across agents. So, the consequences I desire can be different from the consequences that you desire. So, here we look at it as agent relative consequentialism. So, each one of us is independent in that sense. Agent neutral consequentialism talks about each agent has the same ultimate aims, right. So, that different agents aims cannot conflict, and utilitarianism is a classic example of same ultimate aims. So, we may be different in our some of our aims, but some ultimate aims are common, and when we address them we are looking at an agent neutral version of consequentialism. Say making a wide generalization that all of us require would like to be in a better state of health, all of us would like to live in a comfortable environment, would like to live in a secure environment. So, the state, again I give the example of the state or the government, which is looking at providing these ultimate aims of human beings or its citizens. So, the ultimate aims is that there should be safety of person in society. So, the safety in person of society is the same ultimate aim across citizens, and therefore, the role of the state to enforce that. In doing that, the state is being an agent neutral consequentialist, right. So, it is bringing out something which is it considers important and is an ultimate aim for all citizens. Then there is act consequentialism and rule consequentialism. Again, if we push forward, and we are just looking at the preliminary divisions of consequentialism for you to grasp that there can be so many strains and versions of consequentialism. Act consequentialism, as the name implies, is the consequences of an act. So, when you judge an act by the consequences of that act, you are an act consequentialist. This will make sense when you look at its contrary, which is rule consequentialism. So, when we design rules which bring about better consequences. Acts are independent particular acts that we talk about and look at their consequences, but when we talk about rules, say we make a rule that there should be the law enforcement can arrest troublemakers, right. So, the police can arrest troublemakers. Now, this is a rule, and a rule which can be seen from a rule consequentialist perspective, that as long as this rule is being followed, there is a sense of safety and security in the society, that police is arresting the troublemakers, right. Now, for the act consequentialist, it could be, is this person, is this trouble going to create more difficulties or more trouble, then we need to arrest that person. So, that is on a case to case basis, but as a rule, if you are a troublemaker, the police will arrest you, and this is the consequence of such a rule is that the society becomes a safer, better place to stay. So, rule consequentialism is often designing rules which bring about consequences. Let us think of a rule which is not an example of rule consequentialism, or which can be seen as not an example of rule consequentialism. The rights of the troublemaker. The troublemaker who is being arrested by the police has the ability to be tried to get a fair trial, right. That is a part of the rights. The troublemaker has the right not to be physically manhandled, right. So, these are also rights that are inherent, that are intrinsic to the nature of a good law, and these are non-consequential. in a certain sense you can also look at them as consequential, because they ultimately bring about the better a sense of safety and security in the society, especially in the case of arrest of a mistaken troublemaker or unintended or wrongfully arrested, wrongfully charged troublemakers. We will come to that to see how rule consequentialism comes close to deontology, how a single practice can have different motivations behind them. So, before we go to that similarity, let us take a brief look at what is non-consequentialism. So, the question that we started with, if not consequences, then what? What does matter? So, the character of an act, intrinsic value independent of the consequences, intrinsic value of independent of the consequences. And here the first example or the classic example that I would like to start with is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, what does the I have picked up the 11th article or the first part of the 11th article of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is, everyone charged with a penal, I quote, read from the quote, everyone charged with a penal offence has the right to be presumed innocent until proved guilty according to the law in a public trial, at which he has had all the guarantees necessary for his defence. And with this, let me jump to the example that I have in mind. A few years back, a group of terrorists attacked the city of Mumbai in India, and in that attack there was a terrorist, or there was a person called Ajmal Kasab. Now, there was this was an attack that took place in Mumbai. It was over 2 to 3 days or around that, and there was enough news channels covering, there were enough people watching. So, the guilt of Mr. Kasab was established, because almost the whole world knew, the whole world was watching on live TV. There were enough evidences out there, and it seemed that this was an Mr. Kasab was apprehended alive, but was given a trial that lasted many months, a trial in which he was presumed until proven guilty according to the law, not according to public perception. So, we can also understand the angst of people who said that, well, this was such a clear open and shut case, what is the need for having such a lengthy trial, what is the need to establish this act when it has been visible to everybody. But the law declares it so, and the Indian law required that the person that Mr. Kasab was tried, Ajmal Kasab was tried in a public trial or in a private trial, but he was tried according to the laws of the land. He was also given a defense, that he needs to present his defense, and once his crime was legally established, he was sentenced and given to that punishment. Now, if you think that it was a waste of time and government resources, you are probably thinking of it in terms of consequentialism. But if you were thinking that in doing this process, the Indian state and India as a nation did a good thing and established itself as a law abiding nation, then you are looking at the non-consequentialist value of such a practice. What is the non-consequentialist value? That everyone is given, every accused is given a chance to prove his or her innocence. The trial has to be a public trial, not a single person's judgment or decision, but according to the law of the land, not on the whims of a person. So, the fact that we have this is an example of something which is inherently about the character of this act, this provision, that people are given an opportunity to represent themselves if they are charged with any crime. So, to have this right, that one has the right to defend oneself legally, is an example of a non-consequentialist ethics. The consequences of this were a further delay of 11 months. Imagine the anguish faced by the victims, the families of victims, and the sense of anger and helplessness at the punishment taking so much of time because law is establishing the crime. But on a broader perspective, that this also, the crime once established, the punishment will be given and was given, but the establishment of the law made a difference between the terrorists and the civilized state. The terrorists did never charge or given opportunity to their victims to defend themselves, to accuse them of what the terrorists think that they were doing, or what the representative of the nation state that they were. So, as being given a right is an example of non-consequentialism. Now, there can be many kinds of non-consequentialist ethics. The classic or the most often referred to ethics in consequentialism is the deontological ethics of Immanuel Kant, who talks about a sense of duty. Now, duty is crucial because duty is non-consequentialism, something that needs to be done. In the classic adage, when we say what's to be done has to be done. So, that means the force of the duty powers the duty, not what it yields to, what it results. Say people of the military or people in law enforcement, people who work there are driven by a strong sense of duty, because a core principle or a core principle of, or a core philosophy of the martial professions is the sense of duty. So, they do not need to judge what is the long term or short term consequences of their act, but they have been assigned a task and it is their duty to fulfill their tasks. So, this is the duty mentality, which is thoroughly a deontological or a non-consequentialist thinking. In addition, you can think of religious laws, especially the intrinsic laws, say something like thou shalt not kill. Especially laws or religious edicts or diktats which are there independent of their consequences. It is not that if you do not kill, you will be given a place in heaven, then it becomes consequentialism, but it is just simply wrong to kill no matter what. I think the crucial word that you can phrase that you can use to understand non-consequential is whenever you can suffix a statement with no matter what. So, thou shalt not kill no matter what, or thou shalt not lie no matter what. Whenever one adds the no matter what, that makes it an example of non-consequentialism. Now, to the issue that we were talking about a few minutes back, the same practice can have either a consequential justification or a non-consequential justification, or even a combination of both. And I have a simple example listed on the screen here. For example, one should not lie. Why should one not lie? There can be predominantly three strains of thinking. One, you shouldn't lie because it is intrinsically wrong, it is something wrong with it. Two, one shouldn't lie because if one gets caught, one gets into trouble, or the whole institution of truth telling comes into difficulty. So, promise keeping becomes difficult. Society survives on a system of contracts and promises, and if we start breaking promises, it upsets the system as a whole, right. Or like for perhaps most of us, a calibrated threshold where A may be violated when B exceeds the threshold. So, I mean most of us would perhaps lie if it saves the life of an innocent person. But some of us who are very strongly rooted on A, or they think something non-consequential, deontologically essential about not lying, they would not lie even to save a life. And some people who really think of consequences would not think of lying as a moral problem at all, as long as it brings about the desirable consequences. And perhaps for the most of us, it is a calibrated threshold. We would like not to lie, but unless until the threshold is high, or wherever we peg our threshold, we start lying there. So, the same act can be justified or can have different philosophies beneath it. So, as an analyst, as a philosopher or as a philosophical analyst, you should be able to unearth the philosophy behind the particular act. And this I would argue is also the reason why there is a human judge in the court of law. The laws seem to be given in law books. What is the role of the human judge in the court of law? The role of the human judge in the court of law, amongst many other roles, is to unearth what is the motivation of the person charged, right, to factor in the context. So, to look at this threshold and calibration and then apply the laws to take a decision. So, with this now you should be reasonably clear about what are consequentialist theories and what are non-consequentialist theories. You should be able to identify the non-consequentialist motivation of a practice and a consequentialist motivation of a practice. With this, we come to an end of our discussion of consequentialism and non-consequentialism. Thank you.